Hereford, late November 1326. The sky is the color of old iron, and the market square has been turned into a temporary cathedral of vengeance. Timber groans as men lash beams together, raising a scaffold that climbs nearly 50 feet far taller than it needs to be to kill a man. It is built for visibility, not efficiency. Every merchant, every apprentice, every widow at the edge of the crowd is meant to see what happens when a subject grows too close to a king. The platform is not just a place for death. It is a statement that the realm has decided to cut something out of its own body. Welcome to medieval spirits. If you like dark forensic history that strips away the polished myths like subscribe and ring the bell, tonight we walk into the reign of Edward II and the man who converted access into domination, Hugh Despenser the Younger. We are not telling a tidy morality play where wicked men fall neatly and the world improves. We are watching how a kingdom uses pain as politics when trust and law have already been poisoned and when the crowd believes only a spectacle can prove that the old nightmare is truly over. Despenser is dragged forward like a broken emblem. He is gaunt from flight and capture, smeared with mud and crowned with stinging nettles, a parody of the influence he once wore like a crown of gold. His lips are cracked, his eyes sunk deep, and he looks less like a lord than a prisoner hauled out of a ditch. Yet the crowd sees him as more than flesh. To them, he is hunger in a land of taxes, law, twisted into theft and royal intimacy, turned into an instrument of rule. He will not simply die. He will be reduced into pieces because pieces are easier to fear than a living man who might one day return. The square itself feels like a verdict. Vendors sell ale and hot bread as if this were a festival, because public punishment in medieval England was also public entertainment. Children are lifted onto shoulders. Men point toward the scaffold like tourists at a landmark. You can almost feel the psychology at work. If the kingdom can tear apart the man who once seemed untouchable, then maybe the kingdom can stitch itself back together. Hugh Despenser the Younger did not rise as a battlefield hero. He rose as a court mechanic, a man who understood the physics of proximity. Born around 1286, he was noble, educated, and ambitious, but not inevitable. England had many men like him, competent, hungry, and waiting for a door to open. His door was marriage. When he wed Eleanor, declared granddaughter of Edward I and niece of Edward I, he stepped into the bloodstream of royal power. Eleanor was tied to the enormous Gloucester inheritance, and that connection gave Hugh a taste of immense wealth, the kind that does not satisfy, but awakens appetite. Once a man has tasted that scale of land and rent, he starts to believe the country is a meal. In a medieval court, the man who controls the door controls the realm. By 1318, Despenser was chamberlain, and that meant he could decide who reached the king, which petitions were heard, and which rivals were left freezing outside in the corridor of waiting. Access became his currency. He learned to sell delays, to reward loyalty with small openings, and to punish resistance by closing the door entirely. He also learned something darker. A king's private life is a lever. If Edward trusted him in the intimate spaces of the palace, then Despenser could shape Edward's moods, his suspicions, and his sense of who was loyal and who was treacherous. In a monarchy, perception is policy. His appetite fixed on the Welsh marches, a frontier society where barons had long exercised near independent authority. The Marcher lords guarded the border with castles and private wars, and they viewed outsiders as threats to their autonomy. Despenser treated their world like a ledger and a map at the same time. Through aggressive legal claims, forced settlements, and royal pressure, he seized estates, tightened his grip on ports and fortresses, and pushed rivals off their own land. He targeted strategic territory, not just fertile fields, because control of the marches meant control of men who were used to saying no. Despenser wanted a region where no one could say no anymore. Despenser also had a model close at hand, his father Hugh Despenser the Elder, who rose with the king and taught his son the value of ruthless loyalty. Together, they formed a family regime, elder and younger father and son, feeding off the same royal bloodstream. To their enemies, it felt as if England had been captured by a private household that wore the crown like a mask. England was already fragile when Despenser tightened his hands around it. Edward, I had inherited a kingdom trained by Edward I to obey, but he did not inherit his father's hard authority. The loss at Bannockburn in 1314, the continuing failures in Scotland, and the spectacle of baronial opposition made Edward look weak, and weakness at the top always creates predators at the edges. The realm was full of resentments, nobles furious at favoritism, communities strained by war costs, and a parliament that increasingly spoke as if it embodied the kingdom's conscience. Into that tension stepped a favorite who made the king's weakness profitable. Complaints against Despenser accused him of extortion, corruption, and revenge disguised as law. What made him terrifying was not only greed but method. He used royal courts as weapons, pressed accusations of treason against opponents, and treated the machinery of government like a private workshop. Men who should have been protected by rank learned that rank meant less than a royal whisper. For ordinary people, Despenser's regime felt like the weather turning bad, petitions denied, fines multiplied, offices sold, and local officials suddenly eager to prove loyalty by squeezing those beneath them. A regime like that spreads downward. The favorite profits at the top, and the fear drips into every village. By 1321, anger erupted into open conflict. A coalition of barons and marcher lords forced Despenser and his father into exile, and the moment had the taste of relief, as if the kingdom had finally yanked a thorn out of its own flesh. Edward did not forgive. When he recalled the Despensers, he returned them to power with the sharp purpose of vengeance. The rebels were crushed at Boroughbridge. In 1322, Thomas of Lancaster was executed, and Despenser came back with new authority and a new cruelty, because nothing hardens a favorite like surviving exile. He had been chased out once. He intended never to be chased again. The conflict of 1321-1322 is often called the Despenser War, and that name matters. It tells you how personal power had become. The realm was not just arguing about policy. It was arguing about whether one man could turn the king's favor into a monopoly on land and justice. When Edward won, he did not restore peace. He restored the favorite. And in doing so, he guaranteed that the next rebellion would not negotiate. It would remove. The years after Boroughbridge were a slow suffocation. Despenser's tyranny did not always look like chains and whips. It looked like commissions, confiscations, and carefully worded orders. It looked like sheriffs who suddenly discovered new reasons to seize property. It looked like royal justice that always ended the same way: Despenser richer, his enemies poorer, and the king more isolated inside a reality curated by one man's interests. Power became private, and privacy became the state's weakness. Even when laws were quoted, people could feel that the law was no longer a shield. It was a knife held by someone else. He also built a climate of surveillance. Nobles learned that private speech could become evidence. Families learned that a complaint could become a prison sentence. Despenser's network of informants made the court feel like a room full of thin walls where every word could be carried to the wrong ear. And because he controlled access, he could make a rival wait, and waiting meant missing an opportunity, losing a petition, watching a case turn against you. People close to the king began to behave like prisoners who had not yet been locked up, measuring each sentence for risk. Then Despenser made a mistake that was not merely strategic but personal. He struck at Queen Isabella of France. He seized her lands, cut her revenues, and treated the king's wife as another rival to be managed. Isabella had already been pushed aside, humiliated by her husband's dependence on favorites, but this turned humiliation into motive. It gave her a story, sharp enough to travel across borders, that she was a queen made into a widow while her husband still lived because the favorite had stolen him. Isabella's role in the story is not simply that of a wronged wife. She was a political actor in a world that distrusted female authority, and she understood the power of image. When she refused to return to England until Despenser was removed, she framed it as a moral stand, not a power grab. She dressed in widow's clothing while her husband still lived, letting courts across Europe read her as a queen abandoned and abused. By making Despenser the visible villain, she made rebellion feel like rescue, and she made Edward's loyalty to his favorite look like betrayal of the realm. It was propaganda, but it was also a bid for control. In France, Isabella met Roger Mortimer, a marcher lord who had escaped the Tower after Despenser had imprisoned him. Their alliance was born from shared injury and shared opportunity. Isabella brought legitimacy, a royal face that could be presented as the realm's salvation. Mortimer brought networks hardened military sense and a list of men who hated Despenser enough to risk everything. They recruited English exiles, gathered funds, and hired mercenaries because rebellion is not powered by anger alone. It is powered by logistic ships, weapons, allies, and timing. They prepared like surgeons, not like rebels, choosing the moment when Edward's support had thinned to almost nothing. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England, and the shock was how little force they needed. They came ashore on the Suffolk coast, and instead of meeting the steel wall of royal authority, they met open gates. Towns welcomed them. Nobles defected. Clergy offered cautious blessing. Commoners, exhausted by years of fear and confiscation, treated the invasion like liberation. Hatred for Despenser became a kind of national glue, binding old enemies together in a single purpose. Some men joined out of conviction, some out of revenge, and some because they could sense where the wind was blowing. In politics, momentum is its own weapon. Edward, and Despenser fled west toward Wales, chasing the mirage of loyal territory. The flight itself became proof of collapse. Sheriffs switched sides. Garrisons surrendered. The king and his favorite moved like hunted men sleeping in improvised shelter, trying to reach ports and fortresses that had once obeyed without question. But loyalty had been exhausted. Despenser had taken too much punish, too many, and left too few reasons to risk death on his behalf. On November 16, 1326, near Lantresen, the favorite was captured, dragged out of hiding in the wet Welsh landscape like an animal trapped at last. The king was separated and pushed toward captivity. England had its scapegoat in hand. As the fugitives ran, the old order collapsed behind them. Despenser's supporters melted away because they were not united by love, only by fear and profit. Even Edward's authority could not compete with a nation that had decided the favorite was the disease. By the time Despenser was brought to Hereford, he had already been tried in the public imagination. The formal process would only provide the language to justify what everyone expected next. Hereford's market square became a theater. The scaffold was made unnaturally tall so that punishment could be seen from windows, roofs, and the edges of the crowd. Height turned killing into architecture. Isabella and Mortimer were not only ending a man, they were building a public monument to the idea that the favorite's era was over. They needed the public to believe the old power could not come back, and fear dies slowly unless you kill it loudly. The townspeople did not gather as silent witnesses. They gathered as a jury that had already reached its decision, a crowd waiting to see the sentence written in muscle and blood. Despenser was dragged through the streets on a hurdle, the traditional humiliation for a traitor, and the journey itself mattered. It made him visible as he passed through ordinary streets, where ordinary people had lived under his shadow. He was stripped, mocked, and displayed as a warning before the execution even began. The charges were read like a catalogue of national grievance robbery, under color of law oppression, of the realm, corruption of justice, and betrayal of the king's duty to his people. In a sense, the indictment was England talking to itself, trying to name what had happened in the last decade. Despenser was made into the single face of misrule, because a nation can punish a face more easily than it can punish a system. The sentence was the harshest English law could offer, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. But for Despenser, symbolism was sharpened into pain. He was hanged, then cut down before death could claim him, because he had to live through the rest. In front of everyone, he was mutilated in a way meant to announce the destruction of the corruption people believed had bound him to the king. His genitals were cut away and burned, a public sterilization of scandal. Then his abdomen was opened, and his entrails pulled out, the punishment turning anatomy into metaphor, as if the kingdom were physically removing treason from its own gut. His heart was taken and thrown into the fire, because the heart was imagined as the seat of intent. The crowd watched the state dismantle a man like a craftsman dismantling a machine that had harmed the workshop. Some accounts suggest Despenser tried to starve himself in captivity, hoping to cheat the executioner and deny his enemies their spectacle. If so, that too was taken from him. He would be kept alive long enough to be punished. That is the logic of political theater. The suffering is part of the message, and the message must be delivered on schedule. Beheading was not mercy. It was punctuation. What remained was handled like state property, parceled out for maximum effect. His body was quartered and sent to major towns, each piece displayed as a warning nailed into public space. His head went to London Bridge, joining the grim gallery of traitors, a place where commuters and traitors were forced to look up and remember that the state could still bite. His limbs were dispatched to other cities, so that the message would travel even where Isabella and Mortimer could not stand in person. It was not enough that Despenser was dead. His death had to be portable. It had to be seen. This was vengeance, but it was also statecraft. Isabella and Mortimer needed to prove that Edward II's regime had been a deviation that could be corrected. By destroying the favorite in a way that felt absolute, they offered the country a ritual of purification. Yet rituals are dangerous teachers. When a realm watches the law performed as spectacle, it learns that cruelty can be justified as necessity and that bodies can be used as political text. It also learns that once you have used terror to end a regime, terror remains available as a tool. The kingdom may feel safer, but it has also lowered its threshold for what feels acceptable. Soon after Edward, I was forced to abdicate. In January 1327, the political nation articulated reasons for removal, not simply personal dislike, but failure of kingship, misrule, loss of confidence, and an inability to protect the realm. Edward, I still young, was proclaimed king while Isabella and Mortimer ruled in his name. For a moment, it looked like the realm had been saved by necessary brutality. But power gained through dramatic violence often invites dramatic endings. Within a few years, Edward I seized control, Mortimer was executed, and Isabella was pushed aside because the new king learned the same lesson England had performed at Hereford: a realm that can destroy one overmighty subject can destroy another. It is easy to see this as the end of tyranny, but it is also the birth of a new one. Isabella and Mortimer ruled through the young Edward I much as Despenser had ruled through Edward I by controlling access, shaping information, and presenting their decisions as necessary for order. Their legitimacy came from having destroyed the previous regime. When Edward I finally turned on Mortimer, the kingdom repeated the same lesson with a different victim. So what does Hugh Despenser the Younger's end reveal? It reveals the danger of power that is personal, unaccountable, and protected by intimacy with a monarch. Despenser believed that if he held the king, he held reality. He believed that law could be bent indefinitely without snapping. He believed that enemies could be crushed one by one until no one remained. He forgot a simple truth about political hatred: it accumulates. It waits. And then it pours out all at once, looking for a body to carry its meaning. It also reveals the darker side of medieval justice. In that world, treason was imagined as an assault on the king's body and the realm's order, and so the traitor's body became the site where order was restored. But restoration achieved by public dismantling comes with a cost. It turns suffering into entertainment. It gives revenge the mask of morality. And it plants the idea that when politics fails, pain can be used as proof. The 50-foot scaffold was not only built to kill, it was built to persuade, to reassure, to announce that the world had changed in a single afternoon. Comment below with your verdict. Was this justice, or was it a state-sanctioned atrocity dressed in legal language? And what does it say about a kingdom that needed a tower of timber and a choreography of torture to feel safe again? This is medieval spirits. If you want more stories where the past is treated like evidence, not legend, subscribe and join us. In the end, Despenser is remembered less for the estates he seized and the petitions he buried, and more for the day England built a monument to end him, then scattered his remains across the realm, hoping that by breaking his body, it could finally break the spell of his power. History often remembers the drama and forgets the mechanics. The scaffold, the hurdle, the distribution of body parts, these are not random cruelty. They are a language, and medieval England was fluent in it. The body of a traitor could be turned into a public document read by everyone who passed a city gate. Despenser's final horror was that he became exactly what he had made others become: a warning that someone else controlled the law. And once a society learns that language, it never completely forgets it. The beam and the rope become arguments, and fear becomes a form of governance that can be handed from one ruler to the next.